We move on now to Tom Green. Who are you sitting there? Sorry. So Tom, from one of the founding members of CSOL, am I correct in saying that? And a member of the Brighton and Hove CLT.
Yes.
Would you like to sit in this?
Yeah, sure. Come
Sit here.
on. Does this as well? Yeah, it does. Cool. So I'm going to talk, my presentation is called Architecture for the Many, How Can the Commons Shape the Future of Design? So I'm really going to try and talk about the framework and the conceptualization of the commons as this kind of third way of managing things outside of kind of private interests or the state. And then we're going to look at an example of how the commons has been managed in Vienna through their cooperative and social housing program. And then ask the question of how can we apply the commons to student housing in the UK, and this concept of housing being a sort of commons and a common resource, and how that might look in terms of student housing here in Britain. So first I have to ask a question like to everyone, is Britain broken? I'm sure many people have experienced the kind of encroachment of neoliberalism and financialisation over the last kind of 50 years. Many people would have come here perhaps by train today and will probably have suffered, cancellations or delays on that. And those kind of things are just a symptom of the deconstruction of commons and collective approach to things, and also the reduction in state capacity that's happened in the UK. But in terms of housing, we've lost a lot of the kind of radical and ambitious planning that we had in England in sort of the post-war era. So back then, a lot of housing was built as social housing. So up till 1957, after the war, they built 2.5 million new houses, and of those, 75% were built as social homes. So it could be argued that in the post-war era, there was a much stronger focus on the commons and collective ownership. But this, in recent times, has kind of diminished with the sort of neoliberal policies of Margaret Thatcher, right to buy, which allowed tenants to buy their council homes. So Britain's supply of affordable housing has been in decline, and there's been no concerted policy over the last 50 years to kind of instigate massive investment in public housing and reform planning laws and reevaluate our approach to kind of urban design in the UK. So what do we kind of notice from the spaces of the mid-century housing estates? Well, we can kind of see that they were kind of more open, they had wide open pathways, and everyone was connected to a shared path by a single pathway. And this can be interpreted in different ways. Perhaps everyone has their own private entrance to their own private plot of land, but in another sense, perhaps everyone is drawn to the shared space that comes from the shared pathway, and everyone is linked to the kind of shared collective space in the middle. Perhaps it's like, therefore, not so much a lack of privacy, but more of an invitation to form community and to share a common area, but it's much bigger than what it would be if that common area was chopped up into more smaller but private spaces. However, in Britain today, social housing still carries quite a stigma, and housing estates have become associated with sort of a lot of deprivation and crime. So that's something we'll touch on a bit later, is how we reframe that attitude towards these kind of collective approaches to housing. So this is an example of a modern housing estate, which is a lot different to the ones built in the past. So this is an example of where like it's a fence design gone wrong. It's supposed to be an example of, and it exemplifies the lack of care and design ethic that goes into modern urban design and building practices, and also shows the kind of level of privatisation and individualism that we've created, where everyone has these kind of coffin-sized gardens chopped up into small spaces with high fences that keep out the neighbours and kind of encroach you into your own world and prevent you from setting up community. So we come to this question of kind of private sufficiency versus public luxury, and this was detailed in a policy paper for the Labour Party called Land for the Many, where they address the idea that there isn't really enough space in England for everyone to have their own private luxury, but instead we should really be thinking about investing our time and energy into the public realm much more, not just through the state, but also through the commons in that way. So when we're looking at students and student housing, rents are at record highs, and buying a house is more unaffordable than ever. So for students these days, when my parents bought a house perhaps maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, homes were maybe sort of 4 or 5 times the average salary, whereas nowadays buying a house is 19 times the average salary, which far outpaced the rate of inflation and the rate of wage growth. So for young people, the idea of buying their own home and having their own place to live is now more of a dream than it is a reality. So we see that there's a short-termist approach here. And this image is a picture of accommodation at Edinburgh University, actually. So this was PhD students or postgrad students who arrived at Edinburgh University that couldn't find any private accommodation to live in because there was just too much, the market wasn't good enough, rents were too expensive. And the solution done by Edinburgh University was to provide everyone with this kind of temporary bunk bed accommodation in someone's kitchen. I think it was Student Hall's kitchen. So it just shows that the university estate these days is not interested in investing in long-term housing solutions and adopts a more short-termist approach. They're relying on the fact that students are clients, students are kind of commercialised, students won't be with them for the long term, and therefore they can be treated more of as a commodity than as a human being who is invested in the kind of the academic university estate. And I'm sure many people who have been students in this room have experienced similar housing issues, whether that's with mould, damp, or unresponsive landlords, or issues trying to find affordable places to live. So we have this idea of therefore approaching things in a slightly different way. So agency, belonging, self-made, democratic and sustainable approaches to the problems we face today, these are all things that we could theoretically associate with private interests in resources. But as we've often seen, this is not the case in material reality, and a gap exists to provide something different. And this gap has to come from kind of grassroots approach, and that's what forms what we call the commons. So the commons consists of three elements, usually a resource, such as a plot of land, a community that manages and controls the resource, and then the rules that the community then creates to kind of develop and secure the management of that resource. And some examples of a commons include things like allotment associations, common land such as Dartmoor National Park, and then community land trusts on the right. So a true commons is not managed for the accumulation of profit or capital, excuse me, but instead it's managed to provide a resource for people, a common resource for people. So we also require a sense of place and collaboration. So yeah, this is what I was touching on in terms of a commons has to exist by self-management and autonomy. It cannot be a top-down approach. It has to come from the bottom up and a grassroots vision. So doing things differently. So if we look at, so what can we learn from elsewhere? So if we look at Europe, for example, in some countries such as France, Germany, or some of the Nordic countries, up to 20% of their private housing stock, rented housing stock is cooperative or socially rented. But perhaps the most stark model of a different kind of urban development and urban planning comes from Vienna in Austria, and their radical changes that they first instituted at the start of the 20th century. So Vienna's rich layers of architecture include the cobbled streets of the old medieval centre, through to the late 19th century Art Nouveau, and then of course the 20th century kind of Viennese modernism. So they've got a sort of broad history of architectural styles in Vienna. But Vienna also has a long history of progressive housing policy that stems right back to the early 20th century. This is the Karl Marx Hof apartments that were designed at the start of the early 20th century in a new phase. So this was an era where the new government of the left of centre party in Vienna started a massive investment in a social housing programme. So they built, I think, 65,000 houses pre-1934, which is when the Nazis took over. So Vienna is therefore the largest home-owning authority in Europe. London has about 800,000 socially rented apartments, but these are owned by local councils, not by one single authority. And if you count also the number of cooperative tenants in Vienna, which there are about 200,000 cooperative dwellings, then more than half of Vienna's population live in socially rented or cooperative accommodation. So the idea of this massive social housing programme was to build housing that was affordable, hygienic and beautiful. Everyone should have so they believe that the right to beauty should not just belong to the rich. So this design here is designed to look like a kind of fortress or castle akin to those of the kind of rich people of the early ages. So the beauty of these buildings helped attract the middle classes, and the mixed and diverse community that this created helped to break down the barriers and reduce the stigmas of social housing. And there was, of course, a lot of outcry from people of different political persuasions at the time who insisted that the workers, or who they termed the proletariat, would feel out of place in such grandeur, but the reality was probably quite different. So from the 1920s onwards, the city and the city authorities insisted that the flats and the developments that were being built were well insulated, well ventilated, and the tenants should have access to gyms and swimming pools, including the kind of fabulous Ameliabad Art Deco public baths. So these were designed by Otto Nagel and Karl Schmalhofer on behalf of the Workers' Party of Austria in 1926. So there was a clear focus on making living spaces durable, livable and healthy, and there was a strong focus in creating a kind of a big public realm. Now, one of the newest social developments in Vienna even has swimming pools on the roofs for residents. And under legislation passed since the millennium, 50% of all new developments must have green space. And in 2019, Vienna introduced a new zoning rule that means developments of more than 5,000 square metres of living space, 2/3 must constitute subsidised social housing. So what do we feel as we move into these spaces? Well, for me, these spaces can feel quite imposing, but they also feel welcoming and of a grand scale. They provide a sense of kind of pride in the place that I live, but also a sense of community, coexistence and shared aims. When we sort of start to understand why these spaces were designed this way and how they were designed, perhaps that might add another sense of feeling to the space. And how might the community cohesion improve if the spaces are well designed? For example, if everyone has the right to beauty, how might that break down class and other kinds of cultural barriers that exist in these spaces? This is the inside of the original Karl Marx Hof interior. So I wanted to ask the question, like, what does moving through a space like this feel like? Does the politics of the space and what it was built for influence our feelings about the space, as well as its aesthetics and its practicalities? And a little bit about a case study example. So this is Max Schranz, who moved into an apartment in Vienna after leaving his family home. And this is the kind of apartment that most people dream of inhabiting at the peak of their career. He was interviewed for The Guardian, and he said that at only 26, he lives in a bright fifth-floor apartment with high ceilings overlooking a European capital city, 10 minutes from the central station, and within walking distance of all the kind of amenities that you need, like cinemas, theatres and bars. And he only pays €600 per month for that privilege as a result of their investment in social housing and the commons. And then cooperative housing in Vienna, just touching on that a little bit. So there are over 200,000 cooperative houses in Vienna. Most of these are built with municipal subsidies, so the local government will have special loans and finance options to help co-ops fund mortgages, and in turn the co-ops help meet state housing targets. But for this, interested groups can therefore meet their own housing needs as they arrive. So talking about architecture and the commons for students, this is UEA's brutalist student housing, and perhaps this provides us inspiration from a more radical past of not only architecture but the university estate, perhaps an era when universities were less financialised and more open, and investment in the student as a person and as a creative was more so than now, when they're treated more as sort of cash cows. And I found these quickly on the internet, but these are kind of a new design of sort of modular housing for students or for young professionals, and they're made out of like cross-laminated timber, cheap and easy to assemble. And the question is, are modern building techniques the key to scaling community-led housing as well? And can we build the kind of beautiful but imposing style of the Vienna model that they built for the workers in the early 20th century, and can we apply that kind of design code and practice to our modern housing builds in the UK? But most modern student housing in the UK or in England looks something more like this. And this is part of the new sort of East Slope development at the University of Sussex. And it has a very simplistic design. It's often not very well built, and it comes at a very, very high price. And on the inside, this is a picture of the pre-development of Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op. So you'll notice in here the feeling of this space. It's a large student housing co-op, about 106 people. And of course, for only one kitchen on one floor, you'll have maybe 10, 15, I don't know how many people using it. But in this space, and this is a promotional photograph as well, you'll see there's only 2 chairs around a very small table for what would be a lot of people. The sofa doesn't look barely big enough to sit on, and the space doesn't really feel very welcoming and inviting. And it's very evident that there haven't really been many provisions made for different groups of people. So the countertops are quite high, which perhaps doesn't function for people in a wheelchair who need lower surfaces. The lighting in the space looks very monotone and undynamic with bright white lights. And there doesn't seem to be any sense of like individualism and self-made elements to this space. Now, if you lived in Sussex, sort of pre-East Slope development, it looked a bit like this. So this was the original East Slope, and apparently this was built for the original builders of the University of Sussex. And then they decided that if it was good enough for the builders, it would be good enough for the students. And they've never invested in anything different until now. And the inside of the old East Slope looked a bit like this. So again, it's a very kind of almost prison-esque space. The windows are too high to even see out of. The walls kind of feel quite narrow and imposing, and there's a bed at one end and a desk at the other, and there's not much else to it. It's a very simplistic space. And if you compare this to the kind of grandiose vision that they had in Vienna and the kind of model apartments that they were giving to people and the wide open spaces of Vienna, we have to ask, like, what kind of feeling does this give us? And how does this make us feel in comparison to what we saw before? So again, this is the new East Slope at the University of Sussex, and this is the kind of grandiose vision of Vienna. And the question is, thinking about how you compare those two spaces and what they feel, and how they make us feel. So why does student housing not feel like a commons? Well, there's lots of reasons for that I think many people have already touched on today. Obviously, first and foremost, students are transient. There's a lot of change. Often students are on courses that are 3 to 5 years long at the max, and most students are forced to move out of their accommodation every year. At the very least, they have to move out of the university accommodation after the first year, unless they have a very good reason to stay. And most landlords are looking to up rents every year, and so people obviously can't afford to stay in the same place for a long period of time. This means that there's less long-term stability and less opportunity for people to invest in long-term belongings. Coupled with insecure contracts and minimal public space, it means that people don't have this sense of community. And of course, high rents tend to force people out, which is the opposite of the Vienna model, which tried to reduce social stigmas and bring people from different backgrounds and perhaps different class boundaries together in a shared space, whereas the model we have tends to force people out and move people on as quickly as possible. So then I've just got some images comparing and contrasting the before and after of Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op, what the spaces look like and how they make you feel. And again, with the kind of bedrooms, you can see in the second images on the right-hand side, you can see a lot more self-made. People have put up blinds. The furniture looks more sturdy, perhaps more long-term, made out of proper wood. You can tell that people have stuck their own art on the walls. And you can see that this is a space that is lived in rather than just occupied. There are signs of the life that people live in the space on the right, whereas on the left, it seems to be just a place where people go to sleep. So I guess my question for the roundtable discussion is, how do we flip student housing income from a kind of private enterprise that exists to make money out of people to a commons and a common resource that we could use, we could all share, yeah. Thank you.